forum. It is really a particular personal pleasure for me to introduce today's guest, who is known, I'm sure, to everyone here, but I'm going to take a minute, nevertheless, to introduce Tim Kay, who will share with us his wonderful parallel play. I first got to know Tim at the Washington Post when both of us were working there, and despite the fact that this was after Tim had already won his Pulitzer Prize, he was, in a sea of arrogance, the most gracious and generous and sort of warmly human person. And I found it astonishing, and especially as ombudsman, that anyone would be so kind and so open and so warm and so sharing. And have subsequently come to understand that the challenges that his life has presented for him are only in significant part the great gifts that they bring to all of us, which is so clearly true. And of course, I came to understand this much more richly when I read the New Yorker piece that preceded the book, and then when I read the book, which is an absolute delight. It's a perfect Christmas present for those people who have not yet selected one, and the books are widely available. So I'm going to indulge myself, because of my great affection and respect for Tim, with just a few lines from some of the reviews of the book, which have been absolutely fabulous, and his appearances here and there, which have been fabulous for us at Annenberg, because Annenberg, I think Tim is pretty assuredly getting the word in here and there wherever he is traveling. The book in the New York Times review was called An Improbably Lovely Memoir. He talked about, in fascinatingly precise detail and often to pricelessly funny effect, he describes ways in which his efforts to feign normalcy have backfired. Recalling an adolescent clinch, I'm sorry to embarrass you, with a young woman who asked if he'd still care about her the next day. Tim says he pondered the question, then told her truthfully that he had no idea. Wrong answer. Another wonderful allusion in the Times Review with seemingly effortless grace, which is true. This book is just sort of feels like a natural-born miracle, as does so much of Tim's writing. I remember my husband, David Westphal, who loves music, saying at a party celebrating your arrival here that he thought he understood the music until he read your work, which so richly brought it alive and made him want to hear everything you wrote about. So, a final graph here refers to the expertly chosen photos, which is really true. The photos are enormously heartwarming. It says, it refers to his cover photo, which talks about a beret-wearing, contented-looking, broadly smiling professor, our professor. He's on a park bench in Baltimore. Thanks to the candid, companionable voice of his memoir, the implied invitation to sit down and discuss, maybe the later Beach Boys records, which he marvelously describes as vaporous, ethereal, elaborately ornamented musical clockworks, distinguished by a blossoming tenderness and sheer sonic splendor, is all but irresistible. So now I give you the irresistible Professor Cole.
Thank you for those much too kind words, Geneva and Janet Maslin, and it's just terrific to be here today. I have some members of my family, both immediate and dear friends for many, many years here today too. So, as well as the many new friends I've made here at Annenberg, and I'm just I'm delighted to be here. It's a wonderful place to work, and I'm just enjoying myself wildly. I don't know why I did all those years in newspaper, but I guess it ended up working out. I thought I'd talk a little bit about the whole business of writing a memoir and the choices that one has to make. And I'm actually going over one right now, which is a little uncomfortable. There's one chapter in the book which is not remotely funny. It's chapter 9, and it's the telling of a terrible accident I was in when I was 17 years old, and 2 people were killed. The driver was drunk. He was a terrifically kind, decent guy who, for the first time in his life, tried one of those drinks that I think nobody drinks more than 2 or 3 times in their life, called Southern Comfort. And he drank a great deal of it, got behind the wheel of a truck. A whole bunch of us jumped in the back of the truck, and we smashed into a telephone pole. And 2 people were killed. I broke my leg. A lot of people were thrown into the night. It was completely his fault. Completely a reckless, foolish, horrible tragedy perpetrated by a guy who is fundamentally an extremely sweet guy who was 17 years old. He's now 55. And when I started to write a memoir, because you pick and choose amongst what has happened to you in your life, you find yourself making some strange choices. One of the things I tried very hard to do in this book was not to include bitterness towards really pretty much anybody, including some people who I guess I could have been bitter at. Oh, I do mention that a 4th grade gym teacher I had is the one person I just might swerve to hit on a deserted road. But aside from that, I tried very hard not to make any pain for anybody. But what I found out via this new world of Facebook, which I have joined and am rather exhilarated by, but also rather regretting in some ways, as I think everybody does who joins it, because you hear from a lot of people. I have learned, for good and for ill, I've learned that the driver of the truck has read it, that a guy who I did quote by name in the book is sorry that I mentioned it, I mean, very gracious letter. Just I haven't actually heard from the driver, whose name I changed. It's the only bit of fiction I did in the book, but I thought I owed him that. I just said I'm going to change his name to Jeffrey because that wasn't his name. But I wrote about it in pretty much the way it happened, which was a pretty, sad evening. Adding, however, that we were a bunch of completely wild kids. And that any one of us probably, not anyone who was going to a school then, not any 17-year-old, but any one of our particular gang of 17-year-olds might have done something equally horrible at that completely, I am immortal, I can do anything I want. And then you add when Dylan Thomas died from drinking too much, they said he died of a gross insult to the brain. And this guy had certainly done a gross insult to his brain. And so anyway, I'm having this strange feeling come back, and I started wondering, well, why did I feel I had to tell this story amidst all the other ones where I'm usually the brunt of the joke and where I don't think I'm causing any pain. I told nobody, and I'm still in touch with some of these people, that I was going to do this because I thought perhaps, the parents of my dear friend John Weatherall, father's still alive anyway, wouldn't want to know of their son's last minutes, or an old girlfriend of mine, who was the sister of the other boy killed, and of course I worried about the fellow who drove the car, the truck rather. But I finally decided, this was just part of the story, and I don't know whether if it's a ruthlessness. I guess it is on some level. And I was too terrified to tell anybody I was going to do it because I knew I'd get all sorts of requests to say it this way or that way. So I finally had to tell it as gently but as honestly as I could. And it's it's a very sad story. It's about 2 people dying meaninglessly on a wet road in Connecticut in May of 1972. But it was a big part of my story and a big part of the town's story, and I tried to tell kind of the story of a lot of us growing up back then, putting it together. So anyway, I'm dealing with some of the more negative ramifications right now. The other thing is, in my opinion, the only way to tell a memoir is to tell the truth and to really go into some pretty darn personal things, you know. And every now and then I look at the book and I go, oh my God. But it's funny because it was actually harder for me to write the first New Yorker piece, which this is based on, or an outgrowth of. And that I was really frightened of, because basically what I was admitting after being a music critic, after being involved in, you know, saying this is good, this is bad, this is, you know what, I was admitting that I had a particular condition, and that, you know, in my worst moments, I thought, well, maybe there'll be people who will think that this invalidates my whole lifetime of work. And I'm sure that there were some people who did, and it made them feel better because they could say, that idiot Tim Page, well, now we know. But what I found as I wrote the piece for the New Yorker, which led directly to this book, was that once I actually wrote the book, the response was incredibly loving, and welcoming, and people saying, I understand you now, people saying, I understand my dad now, I understand my son, my uncle, my friend, my boss, and I felt good about it, because I don't know how many of you know this, but Asperger's syndrome, which is what I have, which was the reason they signed the book, it's not entirely the book I gave them, because I had a lot of other things to talk about, is now being apparently melded with a flat statement of autism now. Have any of you been following this? They've decided that Asperger's syndrome, or at least they're recommending this, will now be just classified as sort of a high-functioning autism, rather than a specific condition on its own. In other words, if 0 is no autistic tendencies at all, and 100 is, say, closed up entirely within yourself, or somewhere in the 20, 30, 40% in between. Matter of fact, I've occasionally said that Asperger's syndrome is basically just the typical absent-minded professor times 5. So anyway, I was asked to write this, and I was really greeted with a lot of people who were very happy that I wrote it, and I never regretted it after it came out. I have to say, with the exception of this momentary this thing right now, which I will deal with as gently and as kindly as I can, I haven't felt at all badly about admitting all this. I had some relatives who said, are you sure you want to admit all this? Are you sure you want to talk about that? And, you know, my attitude is I'm 55, and I'm a lot closer to the end than to the beginning, and I can't be embarrassed that long, you know? It's not like I'm 22 or 23, and, you know, and trying to sort of prove myself and get somewhere in the world, so I might as well, you know, tell the truth. And what's been interesting is that people have, you know, a lot of them have been, you know, been grateful for it. The thing that has annoyed some readers is this is not a how to cope with Asperger's book, or a so you think you have Asperger's, or you know, now about that Asperger's syndrome, or Asperger's syndrome for dummies. It's a very quirky book, which I wrote very specifically as a memoir from the heart of my first 20 years. And in my experience, the first 20 years were by far the hardest, and that life got a little bit easier as I went around the block, you know, 50, 100, 200 times, and I learned how to make things work, and I learned that, you know, being aggressive and being obnoxious was, you know, not a way to get along in the world, nor was tuning out, nor was just going on and on about the things that fascinated me. What fascinated me as a kid were silent movies, old recordings, true crime, black and white pictures. And it was weird because when I was first diagnosed with Asperger's syndrome about almost 10 years ago, I went out and I bought an academic book about it, and it said something, I'm paraphrasing here, something along the lines like, people with Asperger's syndrome have a tendency to be fascinated by old records, old films, old machines. I'm sitting there like, my God, they created a developmental disorder for me, you know? And but the other thing about it is, you know, for whatever it's worth, and you know, I'm still lonely. I'm still somewhat, you know, it's hard for me in unstructured social circumstances. This isn't hard at all because I'm used to this, and I've learned the language of giving an interview or giving a talk or working with people. But if you send me into a room full of strangers and I have nothing that I'm specifically supposed to talk about, you know, I have a really hard time with it. I still have it. I like people enormously. I like the company of people, but I don't always feel that what I'm doing is appropriate, or that I'm behaving the way I should. And so it remains tough for me. But I'm also utterly convinced that an awful lot of what I did in my life is because of my Asperger's syndrome and not despite it. I have a weird memory. I won't remember faces that I see 5 times in a day, but if you want, you know, all the birth years and death years of the silent film stars, or you know, the address for the St. Valentine's Day massacre, or anything like that, it's just absolutely sort of imprinted on my brain. If I'm interested in something, I can learn it, inhale it, write it. It's perfect for a journalist. You know, if you get a subject you're interested in, you inhale it, you exhale it, and you write it all up. I got fascinated by this writer named Dawn Powell, and I just learned everything about her. On the other hand, I never finished a grade past 7th. I barely squeaked out with a BA at in college, and the only way I was able to squeak out with a BA was we had something in those days at Columbia called Course Guide. And Course Guide was this invaluable thing that told you which teachers would give you an A or an A minus just for showing up. And so I basically went there and I read in the thing, and it said, oh, I can take that. And if it was something I knew something about, like we had a great course called Eliot, Joyce, and Pound, and I knew my opera, but I had to take a psychology course, which I got a D in. I had to take language courses, and I flopped at those. I simply wasn't able to concentrate on things that didn't interest me. And when I was a kid, I was always getting into trouble because, you know, we'd have these algebra tests, and I'd sit there in class, and I'd just look out the window, and then the whole class would be over. I wouldn't know a thing about it, and I'd flunk. And meanwhile, if they wanted the names and dates of all the presidents and their wives backwards upon request, I could do it easily. And so they said, this is a bad kid. This is a kid who's just screwing off. And no one knew what it was. When I was a kid, if you were autistic, you were supposed to be going like this all the time, or shrieking, or absolutely mute. And no one knew what this was. They couldn't figure out why it was like this, and I couldn't figure it out either, of course. So it was, it was kind of a miserable childhood. I don't. Sometimes people ask me, you know, whether I'm going on too much about the Asperger's, but sometimes people ask me whether I wish I'd been diagnosed as a kid, and I wish there had been at least that option, because I felt a tremendous amount of grief, embarrassment, depression, anxiety when I was a kid, especially dealing with grades, dealing with recess, dealing with, you know, other kids who, and I wish I'd at least known that there was something that was going on out there, and why I was flunking and why I barely got through courses. And the moment I got my BA, I was out of there, you know, and I just started working on things that I really wanted to work on. But now, to writing a memoir, and I'm sorry for the long digression in the Asperger's, but writing a memoir, it seems to me you have to be as honest as you want to be. I mean, you should be absolutely honest in anything that you write inside the book, with the exception, perhaps, of saying, I have changed this name, you know, so that I don't hurt somebody, which I think is entirely legitimate. But then after that, obviously, it's a process of selection, and you decide what you can, what you want to tell, how you want to tell it. I went through certain things. There are a lot of things in the book that I'm not particularly proud of, to put it mildly. But it was part of what happened. It was part of what made me, and I just feel that the truth is not so terrible that it can't be told. I was also very lucky in writing a memoir in that I've kept a diary pretty much religiously for almost all my life. So I've got a lot of that. And when I was a kid, I'd write, don't ask me where this came from, but when I was like 12 and 13, I'd get a new record, and I'd go up and I'd type out a really long review about it on my dad's typewriter, never expecting that I'd ever publish it, but just trying to figure out what it meant to me, what it said to me. And my mother was kind enough to save all my stories and things like that, so I had a really big amount of stuff to go through, so I could actually go to original sources, which is nice. I didn't interview anybody for the book. I think if I do something about later parts of my life, I will. I didn't go into my adulthood because my adulthood has been pretty successful, but my childhood was very definitely sort of unsuccessful, although I learned a lot. So this is kind of about the chrysalis. This is a memoir of childhood. If I ever do something about the people I've known, the people I've worked with, places where I'm doing research that's beyond myself, then I would, I think, interview people, and I think that's what's done with most of the memoirs, because people remember how you were then. But this is just pretty much from what I wrote and what I felt and what I could piece together. It's strange, it's a quirky person, but I think in a funny way, I feel much, much lighter that I've talked about all this. I don't use it as an excuse. Some of you may know that I fired off an angry email to a gentleman who'd been a disgrace to the city of Washington, D.C., Marion Barry, back about 2 or 3 years ago, and it was entirely inappropriate. I wrote it on Washington Post letterhead. I was nasty, I was snide. They wanted to make it seem that I was racist, and there was not one word or anything about race in the whole thing, but the Barry campaign insisted upon publicizing it, and I'd already published my New Yorker piece, and people have asked me, well, that was probably your Asperger syndrome, and I don't do it that way. I think that was me being an undisciplined jerk responding to considerable provocation by a flack who called me a number of names over the phone. So anyway, the book is basically what it is. It's the story of my life. It's not meant as an apology. If people find it funny, I'm delighted. If people find it inspirational, I'm delighted. If people find it really distasteful, I have to deal with it. But all in all, it feels a little bit like, at least I've said what's going on. I don't ask for quarter from people because I have Asperger syndrome. I get my work done, I hand in my deadlines, but knowing that I have it does let me pick and choose places that I go and do things. And I think that's helpful. I don't limit myself necessarily, but if I know there's going to be a meeting with a lot of strangers and that I'm not doing something very specifically, like talking in public, it wouldn't bother me at all if this room were multiplied to 1 million. And yet, walking across the room and choosing a stranger and just going up and talking to that person without knowing anything about that person, that would be hard. So what can I say? It's a weird brain, and it's a weird book. I hope you like it. You can probably double my royalties if you... and I'm happy to take any questions, or we talk for a bit. Yeah.
I'm going to hog my chair here.
Yeah, I'm sorry, Geneva.
No, I don't usually, but you mentioned that in some ways having Asperger's syndrome has enabled you to do some of the things you've done in your life, and you went lightly over this, Don Powell. You resurrected this remarkable woman. mean, she'd fallen from public sight, and you resurrected her so richly. Anyone should be so lucky. So talk a little about how she came to your attention and why you decided to do that.
Well, you know, the funny thing about Dawn Powell is never lied to a reporter. There had actually been an article by Gore Vidal, a rather hastily written article with a lot of mistakes about her life, including some supposed menage a trois with a guy. And anyway, it was a good article. I didn't learn about her from that. I learned about her from a Edmund Wilson article, and I discovered that they were starting to bring her books back into print. And it turned out that the reason they were bringing them back into print was because her executor had allowed a whole lot of them to go out of copyright, which is the main duty of an executor, is follow those copyrights. And when you're gone, somebody else has to do it for you. The laws are somewhat different now, and I could go on for 10 minutes about that, and I won't. But I interviewed her, and she told me that the executor, who was sort of having her grand moment in the sun as Dawn Powell's representative on Earth, and she told me that, well, Dawn broke it off with her family years and years ago, and all of her family was dead, and she hated all of her family in Ohio anyway, and blah blah blah, and that anyway, a whole lot of lies, which ended up in an article I did for Newsday. And so about 2 weeks later, I got this note from the guy, from the nurse who was taking care of her mentally impaired son, autistic, by the way. That was my first experience with autism, and she said, you know, you really should have talked to her cousin Jack and her cousin Carol, because they're the one who take care of JoJo, who's the son who's still living, and they can really help you. And so all of a sudden I'm talking to the family, and I'm realizing that this woman who's now dead had been kind of a monster and wouldn't let anyone see any of her materials, and wouldn't let anyone have access to them or print, and wouldn't let films be made. And so because I came to be very good friends with Jack Sherman, who was her son's guardian, and I interviewed him, and I was so shocked, I ended up being snowed in Chicago, in Ohio, when I went and interviewed him. And over the next 2 or 3 days, we decided we really loved each other. They showed me all this material proving that Dawn Powell this woman had been recopywriting her novels in her own name. So we joined forces, since Jack was her nephew, and I talked to my editors at Newsday, because, you know, reporters aren't supposed to get involved in their own story, but I thought this was the end of the story when I published it. And we effected a palace coup. And we got all of her diaries, we got all of her letters, we got all of her rights, and we started methodically bringing her out. And we brought out 12 of her novels, 4 of her plays, all of her diaries, most of her letters, her short stories. We've now done something like, I've been involved with about 10 or 11 Dawn Powell projects, and she's now in the Library of America, which I edited. And it was really exciting. But, you know, again, it was one of those things where I got so involved, and I just memorized all this stuff, and I sort of tuned everybody out, and somehow managed to do my criticism. So that's what happened with that. And Dawn Powell's wonderful, by the way. A Time to Be Born and Turn Magic Wheel, Come Back to Sorrento. They're very close to perfect novels. And even the ones that aren't perfect, she's so funny because she's so dark and so pessimistic and so hysterically funny that I think you'll really enjoy her. I mean, I think she's a great American writer, and I'm honored to have become so obsessed with her. And but it was obsession that did it. It was that obsession, and just putting everything aside and just typing and typing and learning, and it was, anyway, I think that my Asperger had something to do with that. I really do.
Tim, you and I have talked about this. Tell me how you worked up enough nerve, I guess is the word, to write chapters 4 and 10.
You're basically talking about the sex chapters.
Right.
Yeah. Actually, it's three and six. But you and I have had this conversation. Oh gosh, I don't know. I figured so much was out there already, and sex was a part of life, and so I just figured, it's probably hard for all of us in this room to believe at all the time, but I would guess that probably every single one of us has made a complete ass of ourselves in the sex department at least one time or another. Not, of course, the students or anything. I just thought, that's part of the story, and my awkwardness. And, there's a sad side to it, too. I've been married twice, and the marriages were both, it's hard to call a marriage which gave me, gave us 3 wonderful sons, 2 of whom are here today, a failure. But we didn't get along very well. And I was distracted and distant. And then a second marriage which was very happy until all of a sudden I realized that I sort of either misread it or done something, but it was no longer working. And meeting people is hard for me. And so I figured, I tried to make it as funny as I could, which I tried to do throughout the whole book. Because, we can, you can either be, oh, poor me, and you can be Eeyore-like and depressive, or you can try to make it funny. And I thought, well, the sense of loss, the sense of isolation from people, physically and emotionally, which I do feel still to this day, much more than I should, if I were, a different person, is still there. And I wanted to talk something about that because it's something that seems to be true of a lot of people with autism or Asperger's syndrome. And I thought I could at least be funny with it earlier so I could then be somewhat serious with it later. And I don't care, at this point. Actually, the only other person who I told I was writing this book, I have a long and fairly embarrassing description of my loss of virginity, which still sounds like such a weird word, but I actually did write to the woman and just say, I don't mention your name, that you might recognize yourself. I hope you realize I was grateful. I hope, and that because I was so embarrassed after I was with her because I had these little friends. I had this one guy who told me that he'd slept with 11 women in the single day when I first came back. And I actually thought, first of all, that he was telling me the truth, and 2, that would be fun, and so after it turned out I was the first one in our group to lose our virginity, and my friends made merciless fun of me and her and wrote our names all over the student union blackboard, and and then I ignored her. I was such a dumb little kid that I saw her the next day and I just sort of be very. And I always felt like crap about that. I look back and I said, what an incredibly lame, stupid, juvenile way to behave. So I actually was in touch with her this summer. I said, I'm telling this story, and I've owed you an apology for a long time. And she was very gracious, and I guess she likes the book. And
Probably grateful finally to hear it.
Yeah, she was a nice kid. Yeah.
Tim, did you show the book to anybody before it was finished or through the editing stages to make sure that it wasn't going to offend people you were close to or chapters of it or anything like that?
I showed it to my brother because my brother, I'm from a family of 3, and my sister is extremely conservative and was very close to my mother. This is important, sorry about this family history. My brother is much more open-minded and was very close to my father. And I let my sister see it, and she was sort of horrified by some of it. And she thought that I was really not nice to my father. who was a weird guy. He was a very weird guy, but fundamentally an extremely nice man, and I loved him dearly, and I honor him. But anyway, so I had my brother read it after that. I said, you knew Dad, and my dad also really loved good writing, and he loved stories, and he knew how to laugh at himself. And so I had my brother read it, and I said, is Betsy crazy, or am I presenting a fairly okay portrait of my father? And he said he thought I was kind to him, that he would have appreciated the character sketch, that it caught a lot of what he was like. So yeah, I did that. I also sent the very, very little bit that I talked about the two women I was married to, who I don't even mention by name. I don't do that because I'm discounting them. I just figure this is a book I'm writing about me, and I tried to leave them, because they didn't come into my life until after this, and I didn't want to go into, all sorts of intimacies about that. So I ran by the paragraphs about them. And then after that, I just sort of said, I'm going to write my book, and I just got to hope that I'll write it, with, as purely and honestly as I can, and that people will like it. So far as I know, nobody who's in the book, except probably the driver of the truck, really, really hates it. He has a right to hate it, I wouldn't want the lamest thing I ever did in my life, if I did it, 38 years ago, to all of a sudden be brought around as we were, in middle age and have it all out there. But I did remove his name, and I did my best to suggest, which I firmly believe to be the truth, that he just didn't get lucky. I mean, he was not lucky. The rest of us could have done something just as horrible because we were out of control. And he was just the guy who happened to get very, very unlucky, and two people lost their lives because of it. And so there's that.
Would it be unfair to ask your sons if either of them would be willing to talk about what this has been like for you? You don't have to, no pressure. But this has been fairly.
It's absolutely fine. And Gary, who was sitting there with my sons and a dear friend for years and years, was actually at the accident site and is mentioned in the book. If you want to say anything, absolutely, any of you.
And if not, don't worry.
I don't know. I think that he was a good dad to have around.
Despite the quirkiness.
Despite the quirkiness. I never really noticed the quirkiness until I realized that other people don't always behave that way. But it all worked out for the best, I think.
Yeah, I'm extraordinarily proud of my children. I'm also, for all the difficulty I've had making friends, one thing I will say is that, once they're in my lives, they're there and they're permanent. I still can't somehow believe, and I'm not a religious person, but I really can't believe that on some level, and I don't know whether this is my psychology, I don't know whether it's some kind of hitherto under-noted mysticism, but I still feel like, these people may be dead now, but at a certain point in my life, they are still very much alive. It's almost like being unstuck in time, that Billy Pilgrim thing in the Kurt Vonnegut novel, where you walk through one door and suddenly you're in 1971. I kind of live that way a lot of the time. So, Sandy, you had your hand up.
Yeah, just one of the things you mentioned, Tim, was, and you mentioned in your book, is this, it's evoked in your book, is this incredible precision of memory. Remembering the record numbers of this entire collection of, was it jazz? I can't remember. Or
Opera,
right?
Yeah.
And that comes to bear in the memoir. So you've got all of this unbelievably precise memory, and then you have these records, not only your own, your own diaries, but things you found, reports, things your parents wrote. And yet your book is it's not a tome, right? It's so spare in some ways. It's not a long book, is what I'm trying to say. How did you sort of manage, in terms of the writing, so much stuff? How do you it's woven so beautifully. How did you sort of go about that challenge of not having it be a tome?
Well, thanks for the nice words, first off, but every now and then I would let myself go on about really weird little facts that I knew, just because that's part of my personality. I wanted to keep it in the book. That said, the real thing I wanted to do with this book was make it just sort of cut like butter. You know, I wanted it to be absolutely as truthful and as seamless as I possibly could do it. And what I did was I just rewrote it and rewrote it and rewrote it and rewrote it, because if you do that enough, eventually you come to what seems like an effortlessness. And of course, it's the entire opposite of effortlessness. And I worked on it really, really hard on that level, just to try to, you know, to hold it all together and make it just flow like that. And there was something I was going to say, and I'm trying to. There was something else that you touched on, which I thought might be interesting.
I'm going to let you think about that while I read something that goes right. I have the same feeling when you're reading this book. It's such an interesting combination of detail and yet lightness. And I thought in the Washington Post review, Suki Kasanabe, or whoever she is, captured that well. She says, "Awash in detail, Page's account reads like a verbal version of the minimalist music he discovered and loved as a teen." But then this is your quote: "As a listener, you've settled in as though you were heading, but merely surrendered yourself." What does that mean?
I think it's a cut from the page.
But merely surrendered yourself to jostle and speed
See
and
if I can
passing
find it.
images. His book is a jostling trip, lists of musical compositions. It sort of gets at what you're aiming at, but you're exactly right. It's the opposite of effortless in terms of what you went through, but it comes across as just kind of a gift to you that you somehow then layered into these pages.
Well, I'll see if I can find the line that they.
Here it is. As a listener, you've settled in as though you had boarded a train and thought
Right.
nothing about where you'd been or where you were heading.
Yeah, and I mean that was definitely part of it, and I really did work hard to make that happen, and I was really touched that she caught that, and I also wanted to get across this keeps coming in and out of my mind when I'm trying to remember what it's about.
You're talking about the music, right?
Oh, no, it's about my father. Something my father said, which was terribly important to me. Although it caused a complete autistic meltdown when I was in 8th grade. I had made a half-hour film with my friends. I had these friends, and I borrowed my dad's Super 8 camera, and we'd go and we'd throw each other around the backyard for an hour and shoot guns and do stuff like that. And I'd done this thing about a filmmaker, and it was a half-hour long, and it had all these people doing mysterious things. Of course, no sound in those days. These were all silent films, and they were Super 8mm. And anyway, so I edited the whole thing and had the premiere, and I was used to telling the stories in my films as I was showing them. And my dad said, he said, I make sort of the script, and I learn how to be kind of funny with it and all that. And my dad said, my dad was a real new critic. If those of you who are interested in the old new criticism, he said the personality should not be in the author; it should be in the work. And he basically said, I didn't understand one bit of that film, and nobody else will understand what's in that film either. And I was thinking, God, I've just done this half-hour film, and no one's going to get it. And so I went into a real tantrum. And in those days, I really lost my temper, and I just screaming, yelling, the whole routine. But then, in the bright light of morning, whenever I got to sleep, I thought about it and realized he was right. And I went and I filmed some subtitles to put in here and there in the film, and I made it into a film, which I think even now, if I showed it to you, you'd probably all more or less understand the plot, because there are enough titles saying, so-and-so died in the night, but the next morning, what he did with that one thing was teach me that my work had to stand by itself, that good writing or good filmmaking is for strangers, should not be reliant upon the host's personal charm or anything like that. And it's affected everything I've done since, in that I don't mind if you hate what I say. I don't mind if you disagree wholeheartedly with what I say. None of that bothers me at all. What does bother me is if I say something and you don't have any idea what it means. I mean, I admire poetic and opacity of language in some writers and some poets, in some novelists, certainly in some filmmakers, but I can't stand it in my own work. Above all, for me, I want things to be as simple as they possibly can be while being as rich as they need to be, and as clear as they can be. And that was what made me. That was hugely important advice.
We can all thank your father. Other questions or comments?
Yes.
Yes.
I have a family member who I believe has Asperger's, and my limited research on the topic has taught me a lot. Your book has, to me, been from the highest profile person with Asperger's. Have you met other people with Asperger's as a result of your book, and are there other high-profile personalities?
You know, it's always dangerous to psychoanalyze people who are dead, but I mean, looking back at certain people in history, and I'm saying, I don't know much about Asperger's, I just have it. But my guess, one that I knew personally was Glenn Gould, and I'm positive Glenn had Asperger's syndrome. Positive. I mean, just from a lot of things I know about him, from his reluctance to touch, from the way he handled his whole life to sort of stay at a distance, yet I think Bobby Fischer probably had Asperger's syndrome. I would guess that Samuel Johnson probably had Asperger's syndrome. Some people have suggested Edison. Some people suggested living people such as Bill Gates and Thomas Pynchon. And who knows? I mean, as I say, these are all hypotheses. I don't know. I really don't know. I've met a lot of people with Asperger's since I started talking about this, and sometimes it's very moving. And I'll talk with kids and I'll try to tell them that things are getting better. There are other times where it's frankly heartbreaking. Mothers will take their kids in, you know, and the kids are much more severely affected than I was when I was a kid and don't have any of the verbal gifts. Some of them are capable of doing just massive amounts of numbers and data and things like that. I was lucky that for whatever reason, my gifts were channeled verbally as well as channeled into what remains an obsession with data and remains an obsession with facts and intricacies and textures and things like that. So sometimes it's exciting, sometimes it's very sad. There are times where there'll be a mother who's looking at me and her eyes are filling with tears and she's saying, we just hope someday he's going to be like you. And those are moments where you just wish you could do something. And I try to answer every email I get on it. I don't always succeed, but I have at least one of those auto replies when someone emails me suggesting some sites, and usually I do get around to answering. But again, this would not be the book. Even I want people to buy this book, but if you know somebody with Asperger's and you're going to buy one book, this is not the book to buy. The book to buy is probably Tony Atwood's Guide, which is marvelous. This is a story of a quirky kid who also happened to have Asperger's syndrome and whose brain is at least somewhat affected by it.
How do you see yourself change after the process of writing your book?
I feel lighter. I feel like I cast off a lot of things. I feel that I was really honest about the way that I've dealt with the world, in a weird way, there was a book about Asperger's syndrome called Pretending to be Normal. I guess I no longer pretend to be normal. I was always lousy at it anyway. So I'm now at a point where, you know, as long as I, you know, I'm a little bit nervous about going to things where I think I'll be anxious and I sometimes don't go to things like that. But if I know that it's only going to be X amount of time, I feel comfortable about it. And I am proud in a funny way. I mean, you know, I love the fact that, you know, here I am, I'm at USC, and, you know, my colleagues were good enough to grant me tenure in April. And, you know, I still sometimes wonder, how did this little, you know, crazy, druggy, dropout, weirdo kid get here? And I got here actually by being myself, which is really something which I'm kind of amazed by and incredibly grateful for to my colleagues here, but also just to whatever, you know, whatever you want to call it, providence, fortune, you know, the kindness of my parents, the support of my friends, the love of my children, you know, and the Scotch tape that holds me together, you know, the antidepressants, the meditation, the anti-anxietal pills. You know, I mean, it's still not a picnic, but I'm doing okay.
You're doing better than okay. I wonder if you would help us think about the ways in which you're such a beautiful writer, obviously in long form, but a beautiful newspaper writer. What are the ways in which some of the things that you experience because of the Asperger's syndrome have shaped that? I mean, you've talked about the sort of, you suck everything in and then you know, pour it out. But there are lessons here about sort of concentration.
Concentration.
And what do you say about that?
Well, I mean, if you are really seriously, it's kind of a predetermined ruthlessness that you're going to study and work on the things that you're really interested in. Obviously, you have to learn and do things that you're not interested in too, and I'm not always so great at that, but I'm infinitely better than I was. And just, you know, just work as hard as you can and do it over and over, write it again and again. For learning to write, I used to write out paragraphs that I really admired, and not ever to claim as my own, no plagiarism, but just to feel the process through which, you know, a magnificent sentence gets done. The other thing is, and I'll say this again, I say it to all my classes, and almost nobody ever takes me up on it, but it is the single way to make yourself an infinitely better writer in a week, is read your work aloud. Read it aloud, listen to it yourself, catch all those quirks, catch all those tics that you have, find out if you're writing the same sort of boring type of sentence again and again. Read it to your friends if they'll listen, but don't take them that seriously unless you really trust them. But above all, read it to yourself and somehow train yourself to listen to music, to language as a music in itself. I mean, I really do think that the best language really approaches music. And I have a sort of synesthesia, which takes music and automatically makes it language in my brain. It's curious, but I mean, those would be my words of advice. Just, you know, write again and again. If you write too grandly, you know, read early Ernest Hemingway and incorporate that into your system. If you tend to write telegraphese, start reading late Henry James or Thomas Pynchon, so you can go out a little bit and just work on them and you know, find a voice for yourself if you can.
And for all of us, read Parallel Play. Thank you so much.
Thank you.